And now we are watching Extra Histories, The First Crusade, Part 3, A Good Crusade.
Last we left off, the disastrous People's Crusade had met its end at the hand of the Seljuk Turks, and Peter, along with the few thousand remaining of those who joined him, were hiding out in Constantinople awaiting the arrival of the real Crusaders. Today, finally, that real crusade will begin. But before the First Crusade can begin in earnest, the Crusaders have to get to the Holy Land, and to do that, we have to recognize one very important point about the First Crusade that's often overlooked. The army of the First Crusade isn't actually one army at all. Rather, it's at least 5 separate armies led by 5 different men from 5 different parts of Europe. Each of them set out from 5 different starting points with the idea that they'd all meet up in Constantinople and move on to the Holy Land from there.
You know, that's a huge operation to take, and yeah, that makes sense. The Crusades were basically a holy coalition, if you would. You know, all of Europe uniting, or at least a lot of Europe uniting, and obviously, you know, it's not as simple as just one guy's completely in control of it all. Like, you know, obviously you have monarchs and princes throwing their lot in there, and they're not just gonna relinquish command, right? Well, there's the Richard the Lionheart, who ended up gaining all power to the Crusades in his own time. But, you know, for the most part, yeah, the logistics of such an operation are insane, though. Like, you know, we saw with the Third Crusade and Saladin, like, some people would get there before others and whatnot. Like, it's essentially a huge invasion force coalition that needs to get from Europe all the way to the Middle East, some taking different ways, and, like, it's logistics. Like, you have to plan that out, you know, like, you have to plan something like this out extensively, prepare for it, and, you know, sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. You know, like when we saw the third Crusade Saladin series, you know, some got there before, you know, but like something like this would require a great amount of planning and logistics and everything going perfectly, you know.
The first army is that of Hugh of Vermandois. This was the smallest army, although arguably the noblest of the noble armies, as Hugh was the brother of the King of France, which was a bit awkward as the Pope had recently excommunicated King Philip I of France for adultery, but hey, why let fraternal excommunication get in the way of a good crusade? Now, from Western Europe, there are basically 2 ways to get to Constantinople: travel over land through Hungary, or head to Italy and travel by sea. Hugh chose the latter of these 2 options. Unfortunately, his tiny fleet was hit by a storm, and he lost a good number of his ships. But eventually, the Byzantines fished the remaining Crusaders out of the Adriatic and escorted them to Constantinople, where Hugh promptly sent a message to the Emperor that read, "Know, O King, that I am King of Kings, and superior to all who are under the sky. You are now permitted to greet me on my arrival, and to receive me with magnificence, as befits my nobility." Needless to say, the Emperor was not impressed. The second army on our list was that of Godfrey de Bouillon. He represented...
I feel bad for the Romans. They are dealing with so much crap from Europe. That the Romans are like, oh man, it's bad enough having to deal with the Turks who are just taking all their territory. But now it's like just the wildness of the European Christians in its own way is just as bad for Rome as the Turks are. So like I kind of feel bad for the Romans. They really got the short end of the stick, you know, especially during the Crusade eras.
The German contingent of the Crusades and brought a sizable force from the Holy Roman Empire, which is only a little bit awkward as he had actually fought against the Pope when the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor were duking it out, and in fact, he directly helped kick the Pope out of Rome, but hey, why let a few armed legions supporting the anti-Pope to kick the legitimate Pope out of Rome get in the way of a good crusade? He and his brother, Baldwin, leaving from only about 200 miles south of where Peter's crusade set out, decided to take the same route that Peter did. But this time, when the King of Hungary saw a group of crusaders pulling up on his doorstep, he was like, no, 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 no. But after a lot of talking, the King of Hungary finally allowed Godfrey to pass through on the condition that Godfrey's brother Baldwin and his entire family stay as hostages. After making it through Hungary without a single looting, Godfrey planned to resupply at Belgrade, but wait, no, Peter had burnt that to the ground. Oops. Now, our poor beleaguered Byzantine governor must have been preparing himself for yet another round of terrible conflict with the Crusaders, but Godfrey's army, like a champ, managed to make it through to Constantinople with only a tiny, itty-bitty bit of pillaging. Next, we have the army of...
Yeah, now you're starting to see the People's Crusade was just a mass mob of hysteria and insanity. You're actually seeing more or less professionals actually handling the situations, people who know what they're doing, so it's already going much smoother, you know.
Of Bohemond, Prince of Taranto. The force he brought was smaller than most of the others, but it was by far the best armed and the most experienced, which is a little bit awkward because most of these troops got their experience trying to conquer the Byzantine Empire 12 years before. But why let unprovoked acts of naked aggression and the near unseating of the very ruler you're now supposed to go help get in the way of a good crusade? So, after sailing across the Adriatic and a ponderously slow march across the Balkans, where their men occasionally wholesale looted the very same people they looted a decade and a half ago in the war, Bohemond and his nephew Tancred finally made it to Constantinople. After Bohemond, we have the army of Raymond, the Count of Toulouse. Raymond led the largest army and what can be considered the principal crusading force. As such, Raymond considered himself to be leader of the crusade, which is only a little awkward as he traveled alongside Bishop Adhemar, the papal legate assigned by the Pope as the leader of the crusade. But Raymond was also old, missing one eye, and stated that he hoped to die in the Holy Land, so why let a little leadership dispute get in the way of a good crusade? Raymond and his forces chose to follow the overland route to Constantinople. Unfortunately, when they got to the Balkans, they ended up passing through a lot of the same territory that Bohemond did, which meant that the people there were hostile, and the land was already stripped bare. This left Raymond's gigantic force hungry and grumpy, and by this point, we all know what hungry, grumpy crusaders do. During the pillaging, Bishop Adhemar was wounded and had to stay behind for a bit to recover. What's more, Raymond was called off to Constantinople to meet with the emperor personally, leaving no one really in charge of the largest crusading army. This huge unsupervised army then managed to get itself in a tussle with Byzantine forces, and, as is the pattern, got itself routed. But eventually, Raymond's remaining men limped their way to Constantinople. Lastly, we have the army of Robert of Flanders, who, surprisingly, had nothing awkward going on at all, as his father had gone on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem a few years back, and had fought for Alexius Comnenus on the way, leaving the family on good terms with the Byzantines. Like Bohemond and Hugh, Robert also decided to try his hand at the sea route, and surprisingly, he managed to make the crossing to Byzantine territory without losses. Even more surprisingly, he managed to make it all the way to Constantinople without any major reports of pillaging or looting. But there were two other fellows leading this crusading army along with Robert. One Robert of Normandy, just to make things confusing, and a Stephen of Blois, both of whom were relations of William the Conqueror. They decided that the crossing was too risky and that they were going to wait until spring to cross. That would generally be a wise decision, though in this case they would end up losing one of their ships where Robert had lost none. And while they waited in Italy, a fair number of crusaders decided that a winter in Italy isn't what they signed up for, and deserted. Alright, I think that's everybody. Now that all the Crusaders are in Constantinople, the real party starts. At least for the leaders of the crusade it does. You see, Alexius Comnenus, being a savvy guy, basically trusted none of these people. So he decided that before...
Rightfully so. that was interesting to see, just all the weird relationships some of these guys had. Some of them were in direct opposition towards the main crusade by Pope Urban against him personally, or against, you know, the Romans and this Emperor Alexius. So and some have already, like, the People's Crusade already messed with Byzantine territory. So, like, this is a weird situation. It's an assembly of a really weird dynamic already, and they're right in the Byzantine Empire. So, as we know, it wasn't in this crusade, but we do know that the Crusaders sack Constantinople, obviously, and that's a huge part in their decline, you know, the Romans, so... yeah, just, it's just a weird situation. I would want to get them out as quickly as possible out of my territory, you know?
He'd ferry them across the Bosphorus. He'd get all the leaders to swear that as they crusaded, they would return any previously Byzantine territory they conquered to the Byzantine Empire. That's the entire reason Alexius got this ball rolling in the first place, after all. As you can imagine, this didn't sit well with some of the crusading leaders, so Alexius...
This was weird. Like, Alexei obviously asked for aid. This is why this all started. Rome wanted aid in taking back its territory, but the Pope called for a holy war. You think they would have specified that huge specific off the bat, but probably the Pope left it out, you know, just for the pretext of holy war. But yeah, that idea he wants just completely relies on just the benevolence of these leaders, who some of them are already full of themselves, and being monarchs obviously want to expand their influence. So it's like negotiating among monarchs as a monarch just seems like it's hard, because you're used to being the top dog and like not having to like completely be subservient to others. So yeah, that's a weird situation, you know.
Decided to talk to them privately, one by one. It turned out that Hugh, in this as in most things, was a bit of a pushover. Godfrey, on the other hand, turned out to be absolutely bonkers. He just straight up refused to go to the Imperial Palace to meet with Alexius at all. So far as I can tell, he didn't really give any reason for this either. He had come all the way to Constantinople, and now he just sat outside doing nothing. Emperor Alexius finally decided, okay, I'll send Hugh to talk to him, I guess. But when Hugh showed up, Godfrey called him a lackey and refused to deal with anyone less than the Emperor. Okay. This weird standoff continued until, finally, after Alexius cut off the supplies he'd been sending him, Godfrey's troops attacked Imperial troops. There was a minor skirmish, Godfrey's troops lost, and so far as I can discern, Godfrey just instantly caved. The Emperor gave Godfrey a small mound of treasure and basically just said, "Get out of here," and booted his forces over the Bosphorus. Okay, that's 2 down. Now it was Bohemond's turn, and he was a wily one. Now, whatever else you may say about Bohemond, he was charming, intelligent, diplomatic, and shrewd. Alexius knew that Bohemond probably wasn't there just out of crusading zeal, as this was the same Bohemond who had tried to dethrone him a few years ago. Alexius was
and he has to deal with him. This is such a weird dynamic. Yo, Emperor Alexei already handled 2 situations pretty well, but like, he's having to manage and juggle so many egos. Like, this is just an interesting thing. It is so weird that Rome was still around during the Crusades. Like, you know, like, they were around for a long time. Like, Rome's just everywhere, that, you know.
Bracing himself for an argument to get Bohemond to agree to give back whatever conquests he might gain on the crusade. But Bohemond was one step ahead. He agreed right away. Of course he would take the oath. But, since he was being so forthcoming, wouldn't it make sense for the Emperor to name him as the leader of the crusade? What? Alexius stumbled for a moment here, but he too was a savvy and shrewd man, and so rapidly regained his bearing, said something non-committal like, yeah, I probably could, hang on. And then quickly shuffled Bohemond off to a room literally overflowing with gold and jewels and silver, and basically said, "What? Look at all this annoying treasure just clogging up my otherwise lovely room. Wow, that's a nuisance. If only I had a buddy here who could cart it all off for me after saying one measly little oath." And measly little oaths were indeed said.
Literally just bought him. He's like, listen, that was straight up a bribe. He needs to do what he needs to do to get these egos in check. Like, this would be a great series. Like, someone needs to make a series about this. Like, it would unintentionally be a funny, like, I feel like a series on the First Crusade. It'd probably be like a dark comedy. It would have to be. Like, I can already envision it. Like, get to it, Hollywood. Like, we need a First Crusade series right now. You know?
But this whole time, Bohemond's nephew Tancred was outside with the army, miles from the city, and so managed to just sort of never take the oath himself. This may end up being relevant to future Extra History episodes. Raymond was next. He met with the Emperor, but flat out refused to take the oath. He went on a whole spiel saying God is my only leader, and that he would not swear to such a thing. Eventually, Alexius managed to get him to at least swear to an oath of brohood. A broth, if you will, proclaiming that Alexius was his bro forever and that he would help him wherever he could, especially against that weasel Bohemond. Alexius eventually said, "Alright, good enough," and sent him on his way. No presents for you, though. Presents are for people who swear actual oaths. Lastly, of course, there was Robert. Their conversation boiled down to, "Are we cool?" "Yeah, we're cool." Then Alexius showered him with gifts, and
So far, Robert is my favorite. His crossing went the best, and he just seems like already the coolest of the guys. Like I like Robert a lot. I think if I had to pick my favorite among this weird group, it would definitely be Robert of Flanders.
said, "Go get him, Tiger." And thus began the First Crusade. Seriously this time, the First Crusade is actually beginning now. Next week, we'll see them march off into Turkish territory, fight battles against people who aren't supposed to be their allies, and actually retake land for Christendom. See you then.
And we'll be covering that tomorrow. So until then, bye everyone.